And we're live.
Thank you for joining us as we continue our series on God's amazing creation. We are on lesson number 7, and we're dealing with the DNA, which is the life code or the code of life. And this is part 1. And this series is offered by myself, Tino Unlap, and Steve Washer. Over the past 6 lessons, we have learned the following: that God created the heavens and the earth, and then he created living things and put them on the earth. He created plants on day 3, sea and air creatures on day 5, and then the animals and man, male and female, on day 6. We also indicated or learned from those lessons that it is very likely that God created microorganisms on the appropriate days where they belong. Bacteria that were needed for plants on the day when plants were created, viruses that were needed for fish were on the day when fishes were created, and so forth. Now, we also learn by examining Genesis chapter 1 that God created the heavens and the earth, and the living things were one functional unit in the world, on the earth. God provided the ingredients that were necessary to sustain life in the living organisms. For instance, he provided energy from the sun that was critical as a fuel for all the processes that take place within the cell of each organism. Now, since no organism could use that energy directly, he also created the carbon cycle. This is a process that he used to link all the living organisms together to depend on one another, because only green plants on land and in the water can convert the energy from the sun into a usable form that can be accessed by all living organisms. And so there was a symbiotic relationship between all of them. They have to work together to survive. And then he also created what we call the cellular machines or the proteins. These were machines that were necessary to extract the energy from the sugar that was made by green plants and to use it to drive all the processes that take place within each cell of every living organism. And this is one functional unit. As we continue our study of Genesis 1, we also come to realize that one aspect of survival is the ability of each organism to reproduce. In other words, to produce copies of itself that will have very similar features to the parental organism. We learn on day 3 in Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, that grain, herbs, and fruit bearing trees, and this is where we begin to learn about the phrase after their kind. All these trees and the grains and the herbs were made after their kind. We also learn on day 5 that sea creatures and every winged bird was created after or according to its kind. And then command was given to every one of them to be fruitful and multiply on the earth. And then we also learn in verses 24 and 25 that the beast was created after its kind. And in verses 26 and 28, we learn that man, both male and female, were made or created in the image of God. And they were to be fruitful and to multiply. And so from these then, from these phrases, their kinds, and to be fruitful and multiply, we learn that God has built into each living organism the capacity to produce copies of itself that will play a role in his creation. Now, what is this capacity that is built into each living organism? Over the years after the day of creation, man began to recognize that animals will produce things that were very similar or identical to them. An oak tree can only produce an oak tree, elephant can only produce elephant, dogs can only produce dogs, tigers can only produce tigers, and eagles can only produce eagles. That was recognized as a pattern by man over the centuries after creation. And so, as man began to delve into science, they began to understand that something is inherited from the parental organism into the copies or the progenies of those parental organisms. And so they call that the factor of inheritance or the factor of heredity. And so nearly 5,800 years later, after man began to understand that the cells that make up each organism is made up of molecules or structures that are called proteins, sugars, fats, and nucleic acids. And the nucleic acids, we're going to abbreviate it by DNA. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acids. And so man began to understand that each cell of each organism is made up of all of these major structures: fats, lipids, sugars, and DNAs. And so they began to formulate the hypothesis that one of these must be that factor of heredity or factor of inheritance. And so by process of elimination, with a number of years of experimentation, they began to eliminate sugars. They're not the factor of heredity. They began to eliminate fats, and they began to eliminate proteins. And so they're left with DNA, and they began to identify that DNA is the factor or is the molecule of heredity. It is what's responsible for passing on the features from one organism to its progenies or to its copies. Okay, we'll introduce this. What is this DNA? Well, we call DNA the life code. And here's why it is called the life code. This code is in every living organism. It is in every cell of every living organism. It is a life code, but it is an instruction manual for the making of that organism. It specifies its shape, its size, its color, everything about that organism is in that instruction manual. In other words, it is a blueprint of what that organism is to be like. That code or that instruction manual is written in a language that has an alphabet that consists of 4 letters. The following letters: A, T, G, and C. With those 4 letters, that instruction manual in man, and we're going to use humans as an example, that instruction manual is written using 3.2 billion of those letters, arranged by the Creator. If we were to put those letters in the forms of books the size of the Bible, you will generate 1,000 King James Version of the Bible. Now, please remember that this instruction manual is located within the cell that we cannot see with our naked eye, and it is packed within the cell in a structure that, again, we cannot see with our naked eye. And yet, if you were to line up those letters, right, in book format, they will generate 1,000 copies of the King James Version, the size of the Bible, and it will be 1,000 copies of the King James Version of the Bible. If you were to take the letters from the manual that writes out the instruction in humans and line the letters up, the 3.2 billion letters, line them up in a straight line, it would stretch 62 or 67 billion miles into space. Now let that sink in just a little bit. If you line up those letters, they will stretch into space 67 billion miles. And again, this is from something we cannot see with our eyes. But if you line it up, it will stretch that far. So after 6,000 years, after God created the heavens and the earth, man began to identify the order of those letters in that blueprint or in that manual or in that life code. After 6,000 years, we now had the ability to line those letters up the way that the Creator put them into that instruction book. It took man 6,000 years to be able to look at the sequence of those letters. And to identify those sequences, it required the cooperation of scientists and scientific groups from all over the world. 13 years and $2.7 billion. It took the Creator microseconds to speak this into existence. And yet it took man 6,000 years and 13 years to identify the sequence. Now, we now have the order of those letters in the instruction manual, in the life code, in the code of life, in humans. We understand a little bit of it, but there's a lot we still don't understand. It's helping us to understand, to deal with the diseases that we have, to deal with chronic illnesses and so forth. But we've only broken a bit of the surface of the information. It's going to take us hundreds of thousands of years to understand that instruction manual, and we will never fully understand it. So, to close this part of the lesson, part one of the Code of Life, what does that say to us about the power and the wisdom of the Creator? One can't help but say, what an awesome God we have. Through what we can see in this genetic code or in the code of life, in this instruction manual, God is glorified. We can see His power and we can see His wisdom. We can see His attributes. And that's how He is glorified, through His creation. We hope that you can join us on lesson number 8, where we're going to deal with part 2 of the Code of Life. Thank you.